Hey guys and gals, it's me again. I want to address another assignment that you're responsible for in this particular class, and it has to do with writing and performing funerals. I want to start by saying that funerals are a tremendous time in which you have the privilege and responsibility to minister to a family in their most difficult time. Um, I've done funerals over the last 20 years, and they have aged in range from 2 months old to 103, I think, is the oldest person that I have had the privilege of doing their funeral. I frame it that way, that it is a privilege because the family, whether you know them or not, has entrusted you with leaving the final imprint, if you will, on the life of the person that they have loved. I've done funerals that have varied in size from just a handful of people, maybe 15 or so, to about 15 or 1,500, I think, in size. So you're going to be asked to do a lot of funerals in your ministry. I did 30 funerals in a 3-year period, so I know that I've done close to 100 or more funerals. Some are easier than others. Some can be jovial at times, depends on the personality of the person and the situation in which they passed away. So I've done funerals for people who have died as a result of drunk driving, their own drunk driving. I've done funerals for people who have died of cancer or some illness. Some have been sudden, some have been long and protracted illnesses. You're just going to get a variety of circumstances. And what you have to understand is that you are going to be a source of comfort in a time that is unsettling for them. So I want you to think about that before you dive in and start doing funerals. It is an honor and a privilege to do them, but they are hard to do. It takes some work, and it takes some emotional work on your part. Let me just say that if I could give some advice up front, if you're doing funerals for people that you know, get your crying out of the way as quickly as you can. I have, on a couple of occasions, lost my emotional composure during a funeral. It's very hard to recover. I stopped actually during the middle of one funeral, apologized to the family. This person had been close to our church, very good servant, and he was the third funeral I had done in that week for congregational members, and I was emotionally exhausted. So I would encourage you to take care of your own personal emotions first. Sit down, have the cry, whatever it is you need to do to get yourself ready to present the gospel of hope. As Christians, we have a great hope when it comes to death, but that doesn't make any funeral easy. And so I would tell you to make sure you take care of yourself when you're doing funerals, before you do the funeral. Funerals can become a little mechanical. They're kind of easy to do once you start getting the format down and you get a rhythm as to what you like and how you like to go about doing them. One thing I would encourage you to get is a copy of this. It's hard to see, but it's a minister's manual. I've had this one since 2000. I bought it really just when it first came out. This one is the 14th printing. I'm sure they have newer ones. The Christian or Standard Publishing produced this particular book, but it's simply called the Christian Minister's Manual. The reason I recommend that, when I'm stuck, when it comes to weddings or funerals or anything like that, they provide me with some tools to get unstuck. So let me see if I can. They will provide you with some scriptures. There are poems. There are words or thoughts that they can help um, formulate within you as you get ready. They have this whole section here on funerals, and it um, I can't encourage you strongly enough to get a minister's manual. I think it's in the syllabus. Brian had put in the syllabus. He recommended that you getting it. They will come in handy more times than you think. So purchase you a good one. Minister's Manual for the Christian Church is the one that I use, and I would recommend that you do that. So make sure when you do funerals, the most important person that you're going to have conversations with is the funeral director. I cannot stress that enough. Let me try to get it to you one more time. The most important person that you will have conversations with when it comes to doing a funeral is the funeral director. They are the expert on this particular issue. Though you are technically in charge, the funeral director will do more funerals in a year than you may do in your entire ministry. So, can't underscore this enough. Talk to the funeral director. Ask him questions about customs that you aren't familiar with. Let me give you some examples. I've done funerals in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, Missouri. In those states, customs are different. It can vary from sometimes county to county in certain states, region by region. Customs are a funny thing. And so make sure you talk to him about customs. Like, do you stay with the body when they close the coffin lid? Some places they have the preacher stay in there with them, and some places they don't. Do you walk in front of the coffin as it's being carried to the graveside, or do you walk behind it and lead the family? Those customs are things that vary from place to place, and you will want to talk to the funeral director in advance about those customs. Are people used to long funerals or short funerals? My recommendation, I rarely preach a funeral sermon that lasts longer than 15 minutes. It is a long and trying process, usually, for the family, and I don't want to drag that out anymore. So let me give you some things to talk about in funerals. You need to make sure that you address death in funerals. It's awkward, but people die. That's why you're there. You can't ignore that. You can't hide from it. You may not necessarily address the manner in which they died, but death is an important part of the story of life, and so you have to address death while you're there. It is different for Christians and non-Christians. If you're doing funerals for non-Christians, you've got a lot of legwork to do, and so you need to make sure you are concise with your wording, but precise as well. So don't make it longer than it needs to be, but make sure you're covering the things that God has laid on you to cover, especially when it comes to their relationship with Jesus. So don't forget you have to address death. You have to address life, life that is lived. If it's sometimes easier when you know the person. You can talk about their attributes, mostly their good ones. No one likes to pass judgment in a funeral, but let me remind you that when you say such and such went to heaven, that you're passing judgment. So be careful with that. Just understand what your role is in the process. You are there to communicate the gospel. You are there to bring comfort. You are there to bring a measure of hope. I often talk about, especially when I do non-Christian funerals, I talk about God's attributes, like where we have the greatest hope is in that God is a God who is perfectly just and perfectly merciful, and only He knows how to balance those two. And so I will tell you that you're going to try to bring a level of comfort into situations where sometimes there are no words of comfort. And so I would encourage you to understand that you're talking about death and life and salvation are all wrapped up in your sermon. So choose wisely. Now, one of the things I like to do when I know the person, especially if they're a church member, I try to think about a Bible character that they remind me of. So be thinking about that as you approach the preparation of funerals. Do think about their character and who they remind you of. If you don't know the person that you're doing the funeral for, it's often good to find a story from Scripture and relate it to them in some way. Although I've often found taking someone like David or Abraham or Samson, if you don't know the person, it sounds really generic, but you're really kind of taking a stab at it. So what I do, you don't have to do this, but what I do in those circumstances is I come back to some common themes. And you've heard me already say this, but it's about life and death and what eternity looks like and who God is in that process. And so there's nothing you're going to say in a funeral that's going to change the outcome for the person who's passed away. But there is a lot you can do to sow seeds of hope and the gospel with the family that's there listening. They're in a very vulnerable time, so appreciate that you're going to speak to them in a time in which they're very vulnerable. So do your best in the funeral service to respect the person. Even if you don't know them, you can respect their life and the care that God has for them, even though they've passed, that God still created them uniquely and that Jesus died for them specifically. And so be respectful of that in this process. Let me give you some, what I would call, the nuts and bolts of a funeral. So a lot of funerals that I have done typically go like this. I usually will have a song that kind of gets people settled back down. You know, funerals, you sit there for a while, and then people are milling around and talking, and all of a sudden it's time to start. And so songs are a good way to do that. The funeral director will help you in this, but the format that I have found that funeral directors like a lot is if you do a song, and then after the first song is over, you or someone that has been designated by the family will get up and do the obituary. Those are becoming less common. If you don't know what an obituary is, it's usually the printout that the funeral home gives. It's on the back of the bulletin that they hand out, or it's in the newspaper. Just a word of wisdom here: if you're going to read the obituary, leave out the part of when the funeral services are going to be, because you're already there. They know where they are, and you know where you are, so you don't have to read that part. The most important thing about the obituary is what the family wants to include at the beginning, details about their life, who they're related to. Also, before you get up, practice those names. Talk to the funeral director about, hey, is this how you pronounce certain names? They will help you. They want this to go smoothly too. So the funeral director is your friend. Get to know that person and let them help you in the process. So usually a song followed by an obituary, scripture reading or prayer, something like that. in place of an obituary, sometimes I will do a passage of scripture or a poem or both, and then pray for God's presence to be a part of this whole process. Typically, after that, you will have a song of some sort. You can sit back down, or whoever's designated to do that will sit back down, and there will be a song that takes place. And then after that second song is when I deliver my sermon. If I haven't said this already, I want to make sure I capture it. Rarely does a funeral sermon of mine go longer than 15 minutes. It is, again, they've been through an ordeal. Your job is to bring a measure of hope and share the gospel. You can do that in less than 15 minutes. You don't, these hour-long funerals or hour-long funeral sermons, or 45 minutes, those kind of things are they just kind of drag out. So be concise with your wording and get to the point. Don't restate it, and then kind of move forward. And then after this funeral sermon is over, I usually close my funeral sermons with a prayer, and then there's a song, and then the funeral director will take over again. He will come up and tell, or she will come up and tell the family that it's time to dismiss, or they will dismiss row at a time for them to come past the body for a final viewing. Again, I would ask customs here. Some places ask or require the funeral or the preacher to stand at the head of the coffin when people come by. Some places do that, some places don't. But make sure you ask the funeral director. Now, what you really want to know is what you need to do for this assignment. And so for this assignment, I want you to pretend that you've been asked to do a funeral for someone in your family who you cared about a lot, who's already passed away. So for most of you, it'll probably be a grandparent, somebody you were close to, an aunt or an uncle who maybe passed away recently. And what I want you to do is just pretend that they've asked you to do the funeral for that family member. And I want you to design it. So what you need to do is ask yourself questions about what songs would you want to play at that funeral to remind people about your aunt or uncle or cousin or grandmother. I understand this could be an emotional thing, but trust me, when you do a funeral, it's going to be emotional. So you have to deal with those emotions. So try to think about somebody who's passed away who was close to you, and you're going to do this funeral for them. So design it. So what songs would you sing and why? Just write a paragraph about that. It doesn't have to be a long, detailed thing. So just write a paragraph about what songs you would pick and why. Who would read the obituary and or scripture and pray? And what scripture would you use for that? A lot of times, if you talk about a lady who is really faithful to the Lord and to her husband and family, and they will read Proverbs 31. They're just passages of scripture. They may have had the 23rd Psalm is often common to be read there. But pick out your passage of scripture that you want and use it in that time period. And then what I want you to do is to write me a manuscript of the funeral and include personal things in there, stories, funny, not funny. I'm asking you to be creative, but I'm not asking you to think about somebody who isn't dead yet. So somebody that you know who's passed away, and just pretend that they've asked you to do that funeral. So go through that process. Give me an order of service that you like, what scriptures you would use in the funeral service, what poems. Just try to write it. I will tell you that my funeral sermons are, sometimes I have actually taken them directly from here, and in one instance there is a copy. I have copied and pasted a funeral sermon that I did in here, and it really covers very, very few pages. Yeah, you're talking about if the average sermon is 1,600 words, you're certainly not going to do that many words for the funeral. So if you're an outline kind of person, just give me the detailed outline of the scriptures you would use. If you're a manuscript person, do the manuscript, type it out, and get it to me. If you have any questions, I'll post some further instructions in the message that I send you, and I hope this video will help you in the process. Please don't hesitate to call or send me a text or email me when you have questions. Thanks.